Lots of organizations and countries talk about doing what you're about to do, but actually very few of them actually get to do it. So I think that's really to be congratulated, all of you, for taking this bold move. I can probably say that it will be difficult, but I think it'll actually be really exciting, and when you finally get there, you'll wonder why you hadn't always done it. What I wanted to spend the next half an hour talking about is some context to where taxonomy and biodiversity studies are going, and some of the challenges and opportunities that we face over the next 10 to 20 years as we push this forward. So first of all, I'm going to give a little bit of context, very, very brief context for both the wider issues, and then a little bit about context about taxonomy before talking to you about a recent report that I chaired. So context then, biodiversity loss. Don't have to tell many people in this room about that, but the recent Millennium Ecosystem Assessment demonstrated here that projected future extinction rates are substantially greater than the background rate that we see at the moment. Lots of argument about whether these numbers are really accurate. They are projections, but certainly even if we look at what the recent past is, it's substantially greater than the past. So we have increasing documentary evidence about the fate of our biodiversity. The second thing I wanted to draw attention to was a major challenge facing humanity is food security. This will be a massive driver for our interests in biodiversity and the influences on biodiversity. We only need to bear in mind that the population of the world is projected to expand hugely up until about 2050. At that time, food production has to increase 50% globally. That has to come from somewhere. And in different parts of the world, it'll come from different ways of doing things. It's projected that productivity per unit area will actually increase in Southeast Asia and Asia. That's what they've done in the last 20 to 30 years. Think of the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, new crops, new strains and new crops. But this is not projected to be the way of change in some continents like Africa. This will have an enormous impact on biodiversity because it'll take a lot of land that is currently occupied by a range of natural habitats and turn those over to the agroecosystem. Put on top of that biofuels and their need for land, and you begin to see an increasing challenge. As taxonomists, as biodiversity scientists, I'd like to suggest that this is one area we really cannot ignore. It's going to be a major driver, and I'll come back to that at the very end of the talk. And of course, as you well know, you can read the literature the same as I can, large numbers of areas, especially in the tropics, where they're projected to be drier, which means the areas that can be used for agriculture will come under increasing pressure. This will bring even more pressure to use land that we currently consider to be pristine and the like. And I haven't even mentioned the changes that are going to happen to the oceans. So I'm going to, with the shortage of time, I'm going to nip over that. But I would want to talk a little bit about looking backwards into our specialist topic of taxonomy and biodiversity, and just consider what's happened over the last 200 and 300 years. And the known number of species is somewhere between 1.8 and 1.9 million. The fact that we don't know that actually is a rather interesting point. And here is the rate of discovery, or actually not so much the rate of discovery, the rate of description of new species. If we think that actually how many species are actually out there, say we simply double that estimate to about 3.6 million, at the current rate of between 10 and 16,000 species being described per year, that's going to take us to 2150 to describe just a doubling of what we believe to be on the planet. If we then think about, well, actually, new tools and knowledge is showing that it's probably an order of magnitude greater than that. So there's going to be 18 million species out there. Who knows? You don't have to be much of a mathematician to realize that we're never going to get to the end of the story. So something has to happen very dramatically in our subject. We cannot go on the way we are approaching this problem. And I think I'd like to leave you with that point, and this comes from some work done by Chris Stalker. So I guess insanity is trying to do something the same way, but expecting a different result. And that's kind of where we're heading in taxonomy. But I'd like to suggest actually that there is a very optimistic future. And I'd like to base that on some work that I was very pleased to lead on behalf of the EDIT, the European Distributed Institute of Taxonomy, and I chaired a group of people to look into where do we believe taxonomy is going in the next 10 to 20 years. We use a series of techniques known as foresight. It's what government and really big industrial concerns used to work out how they might develop in the future. And we consulted very widely inside and outside our community. We talked to people who ran supercomputing facilities. We talked to mathematicians. We talked to all sorts of people. And we looked at people around the world. And as we like to do, of course, in Europe, we find one of the oldest buildings we can to sit in and talk about the future. And that's what we did. And we came up with a report. So I'd like to draw on that report and quickly run through some of its conclusions to suggest how we will see the world in the future. And the first then is what will taxonomy look like? Well, most of the world's biodiversity is turning out to be very small. And here is an entertaining cartoon by a colleague of mine, Mark Blackster. You'll notice very carefully it doesn't actually have any real axes on it. Whoops, sorry. It doesn't have any real axes on it, and it's even very bold of him to suggest there's a log scale there. But the shape of this curve doesn't matter, other than the fact that increasing knowledge is showing us that most of life on the planet is going to be small and very, very small. And that is a real challenge. However, in the last 5 to 10 years, tremendous advances in fields like metagenomics, originally designed to look at whole ecosystems. This work kicked off by people like Craig Venter in the States, where he was famous for taking his boat around the world and taking sea samples and then converting them into DNA and then backward projecting into how many genes there were and therefore how many species they believed there were. A very approximate approach, but this is being refined all the time. People have now done metagenomic analyses of the sea. They've done it of air, so the microbial flora and fauna of New York City is now known to at least the first approximation, and now people are doing it for the soil. And what's very interesting is that we can now begin to look at small but multicellular organisms in environments like the soil and begin to do things that we couldn't even do before, which is to estimate how many species there are and how they change between sites and over time. And so this is now no longer just the realms of microbial, but we can even go into very small organisms. And of course, the technology is developing so fast in this area that we can now take single cells, isolate them, and then do a total genome sequence of them. This is technically tractable. Difficult, but tractable. And that is the cusp of the new world that we come into. Integrating taxonomy, other conclusions we came to was that we need to integrate taxonomy into other disciplines. I'm going to leave this because I want to come back to it later on. But I want to just give you one example of this, of where in the last year, here was a paper published last year, in which they used a very large number of data sets of quite different groups of organisms to work out the areas of endemism and density of species in Madagascar as a platform for making decisions about where they should put conservation areas. The government of, two important factors there, the government of Madagascar were minded to do this, which is a serious step forward, but interesting enough, this was only possible because of developments by the lead author in algorithm development. So this was a mathematical development that allowed the application of taxonomic knowledge. This couldn't have been done, frankly, by a group of taxonomists on their own. So here we are, the new tools are developed by areas outside our subject. Taxonomy is increasingly becoming an information science, and most of that is now moving to the web. And the web is a new interactive environment which people are working. And here's just one very small example. This is one called Scratch Pads, which happens to be developed by a group of people in our institution, but along with others. And interesting here, this is essentially a social networking site. So you can't actually compute on the data yet, but it's beginning to get people together who are interested and extending their laboratories beyond their individual cells. And there are about 170 groups that have developed in the last 2 years using this tool to connect themselves and share information. But probably most importantly, as taxonomists, we need to think very, very carefully about what's going on in this world of how we're describing taxa. I've already showed you that if we carry on as the way we're doing, then we're unlikely to achieve any goal, and the world can't wait for the next 200 to 300 years while we describe what we already know about, let alone what we believe is out there. This needs a very, very radical review. And this is where I think the taxonomic community has to look into itself and say, we no longer have to use the paradigm we've used the last 30 years, that taxonomy underpins all of biology, the world should love us, and because they love us, they should give us more money. That actually isn't going to happen. We've tried it, it's failed. What we have to say is that we as a community will take hold of our subject, we will prioritize the groups of organisms that we work on, using this very limited and experienced community of people to its best effect. That means we will probably have to make decisions about which groups of organisms we're going to describe in great detail and which groups of organisms we'll have to describe in a much more overview and less thorough way of doing it. I think that actually is quite a challenge for us because it's a complete change in our mindset. So this is one area where the internal workings of the subject really needs to think very carefully. So it's not about should we do it, should we write monographs or should we DNA sequence? That actually isn't the question. They're just techniques. They're ways of finding out about the world. What the real challenge is which bits should we do first? It's not that we won't do them all eventually, but which bits should we do first? And to do this, of course, we need to move from what's essentially an artisanal activity. If you look at people's labs, they're not substantially different. You look at where the majority of taxonomists work, they're not substantially different from they were 100 or 150 years ago. And it's only in some areas where they even begin to look different. So we have to move to industrial scale. People have tried this. We have to ramp up, not just doubling the rate of output. This has got to increase by orders of magnitude. And some of the new technologies allow us to do that. And new ways of working, social networking and sharing of data on the web, allow us to increase. And perhaps one of the biggest challenges is the fact that as a community, we don't have the social cohesion that we see in other scientific disciplines like physics, where they have to get together to build their large instruments to focus on the major questions of the time, or astronomy, where again they have to use their instruments. Because bits of our subject can work as pieces, atomized, we tend to focus on that. That brings the subject mainly, it keeps it in the descriptive phase and very, very little into the very broad picture that we require to make an impact in science. When we do that, as I'll show you later on, I believe that actually that'll change what we will be able to achieve. So what kind of techniques and technologies will we be needing in the very near future and the far future? Well, clearly one of the biggest changes in the last few years is the cheap, high throughput DNA sequencing. And I wrote this slide, actually, I noticed about just over a year ago for a presentation, and I realized I've got an error in it, and the error is just here. Moore's law suggests that computing power doubles every 18 months. We know that in the field of genomics, a year ago it was every 13 months, and now it's down to every 9 months. That is the rate at which this subject is changing. So it's very, very soon that the technological challenges of sequences will become the non-issue of the day. We are, as I'll show you in a minute, we're currently doing something on looking at mosquitoes, and we worked out it would take us 3 years to collect the material and a week maximum of a cheap sequencer to do all the sequencing required. The sequencing is not actually the problem. Costs, fortunately, are falling about 200-fold a year. So I just wanted to just get us to think a bit at the moment about what we might call vertical genomics. That's wanting to look at the total genome of an organism. There's probably about 250 genomes known in their entirety. Just think the 1,000 genome project that's currently being mooted will change that 5-fold within the next couple of years. At the moment, most taxonomists and biodiversity folks are actually interested in this dimension, which is horizontal genomics, the comparative, what does the world look like? And at the moment, in just one gene, that's the CO1 gene, we have a sequence for 60,000 species. And they have already been done. Genes from other bits of those species, a much wider number of species have been done. So the world is actually going to move this right shift very fast. One of the challenges we're going to face as biodiversity scientists is how will we deal not with this, which is tractable, mathematics are reasonably complicated but not too difficult. How are we going to deal with this when in fact in 20 years' time it's quite likely that we will be able to sequence just about any organism very, very quickly. The trouble is we won't know what to call them and we won't know where they live. And that actually is the extraordinary dichotomy that we're seeing at the moment. So I just want to talk about one particular initiative, and I know we're going to spend some time having fun this morning talking about DNA barcoding, but for those poor souls who are not going to be with us, wanted to talk to you about DNA barcoding, and that's a very simple idea. You take a standard gene, cytochrome oxidase subunit 1 is used in preference, about 700 base pairs long. The point is, it doesn't really matter what the gene is, the fact that it's standardized. That actually is the key issue. In plants, you can't do this. With one gene, you need 3, but people have finally worked out what those 3 are. And just to give you an example, just 2 weeks ago, talking to one of my colleagues on this mosquito project we're involved in, and she's discovered that one species of Anopheles in Africa is now actually 18 species. And there's pretty good evidence to support that 18. We always knew it was quite variable, but actually now we know how variable it is. So as a tool of discovery, it is remarkably powerful. We now have to worry about, are we going to describe those 18 species, or we will simply move on to their biology. If this was in biochemistry and physiology, we wouldn't wait until we crystallized the protein and sequenced it before we talked about it. We'd get on and do it. And I think that's what taxonomy is going to have to do. So we're going to have to start thinking about describing clouds of data points and referring to those in our biological discussions before we formally describe them. I know people will find that difficult to deal with, but I think it's extremely important to remember that. And here is a shot 2 days ago of a situation for the Barcode of Life database, where they've got here some 750,000 barcode records of 66,000 species. And they expect to get up to something approaching 500,000 species in the next 5 years. And the rate of discovery looks like that's actually on the cards. So biodiversity informatics is going to be an extremely important part of how we do our business. Good evidence that it's becoming open access and open source, a bit like the genomics community. We're looking to actually compute on the web, and that's about putting real data up there that we can do computation on. That's not about information, that's about data, and that actually is quite a challenge. How do we put data up there? And for those scientists putting their data up, how do we give them recognition? Because if we don't give them recognition, then their chances of putting those good quality data up are minimized. And we need to put up taxonomies, that means classification, not just digitized information or evidence. So what expertise will we need? Well, actually, we will need to develop a new cadre of taxonomists, comprehensive taxonomists, people that actually are worried about the nature of the problem and not so much worried about the kind of data or the techniques they use to discover things about the world. The next generation is actually able to tackle this, and that is really encouraging. Certainly we see that in our students, and I'm sure you do too. I think actually the important bit is, rather than saying, please give us money, we need more taxonomists, to do what? Well, what we've already done, well, that hasn't worked. So I think that there's pretty good evidence that actually once you actually show what you can do and achieve, the posts will come. You don't need the posts and then work out what you're going to do. You need to work out what you actually want to do, and then people will come along and give us money. There's good evidence that's happened. Most of the information about taxonomy in the last 10 or 20 years has been about how important taxonomy is. Very little of those documents we produced actually say what have we achieved. And funding bodies fund opportunities, they don't fund need, in my experience, well, certainly having worked for one. Okay, so who's going to use the taxonomy and how? I've given you a couple of examples in the past about them being used for designing conservation areas, but there's an increasing number of interest from business, but other kinds of biologists, mathematicians, computer scientists getting increasingly interested in our problems. And I'll come to this bit here in a moment when I talk about what we need to do to address the outside world. I've taken this from a colleague of mine who's a political economist up at Cambridge University, Paul Berkman, and he was talking about this at a meeting at the Royal Society in London last week when we were talking about ecosystem services. How do we understand the economics and science of that? And most of what we've done in taxonomy, if you look at the overall picture, has been in this area here. If we talk to our colleagues and we listen to what they're saying, mostly they're telling us, I want to find that cloud forest, I want to find that untouched island, I want to find that coral reef, and I want to go and find out what's there because of the high diversity. And we see that as blue skies research, as very basic research. We need to know this. But as I've already pointed out, the world is changing very fast. The need to provide more food for the world means that the agro-ecosystem will become more dominant. A lot of papers published in the last 2 or 3 years about the proportion of our planet that has been affected by human activity, and estimates go up to 75% of our planet has now, over the millennia, been affected by humans. That will continue. So we, as taxonomists and biodiversity people, must consider how we're going to move further along this dimension here. Very specialist groups in agriculture and medical entomology, of course, have often just about strayed up this a little bit, but really we need to think much more about how we're going to move into this area here of highly disturbed environments. They are actually scientifically extremely interesting. And most of that work has been done, I'd like to suggest, by theoreticians and modelers, and the odd experimental biologist, paper published in Nature just a couple of weeks ago, showing that when they looked at lots of plants in plots, where they were trying to relate the number of species to stability, actually the number of species wasn't related to stability, but what was related, what did relate the number of species to was the ability of ecosystems to recover from trauma. And that was really interesting because we're talking about an increasing amount of disturbed forest and disturbed water systems, disturbed seas. And so this is an area of biology that's going to be extremely interesting in the future. So, just about running out of my time, I wanted to say then, to summarize, that actually there are enormous challenges ahead, but I'd like to suggest the most fantastic opportunities. I'm one of those people that, I'm afraid, don't believe that that taxonomy and biodiversity studies are going to hell in a handcart. Quite the opposite. There has never been a time in the history of our subject, in the last 250, 300 years, when we haven't had so many theoretical tools, so many practical tools, and such fantastic means of communication. We've also got a time when a lot of the world is deeply, deeply interested in what we do. And you can see it on the newspapers, you can see it in the television, you can see it more and more. They may the popular view of the world may not be in exactly the same way that we would like them to be interested. You know, please help me describe these few extra things. But they are deeply, deeply interested in biodiversity, and people understand it's under threat. So we have fantastic opportunities. As I think I've skitted over very quickly, there are an extraordinary number of emerging technologies, whether they're on the web, whether they're sequencing, whether they're mathematical analyses, that allow us to do things that we could only dream of before. So our challenge is, how do we understand those technologies, and how do we bring them to do? We will need new ways of working. I'm afraid the old style of doing things on our own, even with one partner, actually will not progress. We will not be funded to solve the questions of the day. We actually won't be able to solve the questions of the day, which are really exciting, without that approach. So you might think, what will biodiversity scientists of the future look like? They will have their individual program, which is probably a collective of projects that they're doing with other very large teams. And that will mean a fundamental way in which we organize ourselves and we give value to what we do. That also means that the users change. They have to articulate their questions in a way that we can get our heads around. But also, we will have to see the world not as this endless debate we have in systematics, which is about, are we a service? We don't want to be a service. That's actually a rather shallow and puerile argument. I'd like to suggest actually what we need to think about is, who are our collaborators, who we want to work with to understand how the world works. And the final point is, frankly, I just don't think business as usual is an option. There are fantastic opportunities there for us to grab, but we won't do it if we try to do it in the same way. So thank you very much indeed.